That was amazing. What does it take to wake up a generation? If we don't wake up and shake the nation, we'll eat the dust of the world wondering why. Why does it take catastrophe to start a revolution? Fear or love, baby. Fear or love. Don't say the answer. Actions speak louder than words. So that was a video, and from the YouTube description, that was from an event where a bevy of Broadway's brightest stars joined a sold-out audience on March 11th, 2019 to celebrate and motivate the LGBT community and its allies through gender-reversed renditions of beloved show tunes, spectacular choreography, and a record-breaking fundraising total at Broadway Backwards. This is the 14th annual edition of the show, and it raised $705,000 to benefit Broadway Cares, Equity Fight AIDS, and the LGBTQ Center of New York City. What will it take? What will it take to shake up a nation? Why does it take a catastrophe to start a revolution? Both this song and where the piece came from, that video, speaks to our theme of repair and restoration this morning. It was the catastrophe of the AIDS crisis that led to organizations such as Equity Fight AIDS. It was millions of people suffering and dying with inadequate resources, research, and support that brought the catastrophe to view. It was groups like ACT UP, with public funerals, demonstrations, and die-ins that made the news and opened people's minds and hearts. It was activists like Vito Rosso who proclaimed, "If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from homophobia. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from racism. If I'm dying from anything, it's from indifference and red tape, because these are the things that are preventing an end to this crisis. If I'm dying from anything, I'm dying from the sensationalism of newspapers and magazines and television shows, only as long as I'm willing to be a helpless victim, but not if I'm fighting for my life." Russo goes on to say, living with AIDS in this country is like living in the twilight zone. Living with AIDS is like living through a war which is happening only for those who happen to be in the trenches. Every time a shell explodes, you look around and discover that you've lost more of your friends, but no one else notices. And it's worse than war, because at least during a war, the people are united in a shared experience. This war has not united us, it's divided us to separate those with AIDS and their allies from the rest of the population. As the numbers ticked up, the disproportionate impact on the gay and the trans community, on low income and BIPOC communities, on IV drug users, the catastrophe of the AIDS crisis was undeniable in the public consciousness. But do you know what it really took? It really took allies and those with power and privilege to start paying attention, for leaders and politicians to sound and amplify the alarm, to listen and absorb the pain and grief of families of those who had lost beloveds to AIDS, to fully understand what silence equals death really means, and to recenter dignity and worth for all people. And yet, the fight is not over. Just as COVID continues to ravage our world, the impact is disproportionate to marginalized communities, to vulnerable populations, to those with inadequate health care. The impact is disproportionate in areas where toxic individualism and the cries for personal freedom outweigh an adherence to the common good and welfare. As civil rights leader and politician Barbara Jordan reminds us, a nation is formed by the willingness of each other to share in the responsibility for upholding the common good. It's our responsibility to uphold the common good. And that means, my beloved people, we must be willing to uphold the inherent worth and dignity of all people. Our first principle. And recentering human dignity and worth for all people is foundational to our faith. I see baby Peregrine. Hi, Peregrine. As UU writer Kenny Wiley reminds us, our first principle is still unrealized in our lifetime. I'll say that again. Our first principle is still unrealized in our lifetime. It's an aspirational hope to be practiced, expanded, nudged, prodded, and endlessly centered and re-centered until we are all free. Wiley wrote a piece called A UU Black Lives Matter Theology, outlining how our first principle has been woven throughout Unitarian Universalist history to the present day and the Black Lives Matter movement. He writes, like the Declaration of Independence and the preamble of the Constitution, the principle of Unitarian Universalism stands as an unrealized promise. It is a map, our first principle. It is a map of the work done centuries and decades ago, and it is a map of the work yet to do. The fight for Black lives now is to participate in radical hope. It is to battle for salvation here on this earth. It is to fight for life, for love, for justice. It is to demand more out of our first principle. It is to demand a more perfect faith. So, beloveds, to shake up a nation, to wake up a generation, we must choose fear or love to build the beloved community. In love, we demand a more perfect faith and participate in a radical hope. And conversely, to shake up a nation, to wake up this generation, we must first pause. Pause and listen and receive. Restoration and repair begins with that holy pause, slowing down to go outside of the bubble of our lives and to receive the stories of others by reading, by listening, by watching, by connecting. And we don't just listen, as Carla said, with our ears, we listen with our entire being. So I believe the holy trickster is at work in my life often. You may have heard me talk about this. Moments where someone shares just the right story or insight to speak to something I've been wrestling with. Or someone will drop off a gift that was exactly what I needed, or a card arrives in the mail to brighten my day. Or sometimes the holy trickster speaks to me through NPR. I was listening to the TED Radio Hour on NPR, And it was all about things that take time. Did anyone else hear this story? I know there's some fans out there. I see a few smiles. It was all about things that take time, noting that some things to reach their full potential simply cannot be rushed. And zoologist Dr. Lucy Cook shared about her love and fascination with the humble sloth. Yes, the sloth. Dr. Cook says that the sloth is the only animal that comes with its own philosophy. Sloths are actually fascinating creatures, graceful, mesmerizingly slow. They are energy saving icons, she said. You know, it takes up to 30 days for a sloth to digest a single leaf. With, as Cook says, a freakishly slow metabolism that is actually the key to their survival. The sloth's very slow metabolism actually means their ability to heal is much, much higher than most other animals. Dr. Cook saw a sloth survive an electrocution and watched another sloth survive a W amputation in the wild. Sloths move, eat, and do everything very, very slowly. And this is how the lovely, simple sloth, as the world's only mammal that lives exclusively inverted, this is how they are able to survive and steadily thrive. It was that last part that caught my attention. The key to their survival is their enthrallingly hypnotic, slow way of being. In their slowness, they're able to better heal and survive. Restoration and repair, therefore, begins with slowing down. To dedicate time and energy with intention, to nudge out into the world and to learn about how others are living and have lived and how their ancestors survived. Our common good in the name of building the beloved community means understanding more of the complexity and the nuances of living towards that beloved community. Journalist and leader Van Jones told us at General Assembly last summer that in the information age, ignorance is a choice. The lack of familiarization with pervasive injustice is a choice. Did you watch the First Friday concert with Chris Matthews and Heather May? I saw lots of folks on the line and folks in the chat. I'm getting lots of fingers. Thank you. If you didn't see it, you can still find it online, and here's the link. Look at that. Thank you so much, Sylvia. It was amazing. It was powerful and it was soulful. It was like sitting on a couch in their living room, and Chris and Heather sang into our souls. I'm still here. I'm still here. And Chris at one point talked about pandemic perks and asked us to share some. And as I was thinking about this morning's worship service, I reflected on the pandemic perk of, with intention, slowing down. The pandemic perk of having the time and space to be curious about the world. I've mentioned that curiosity is a holy spiritual practice. To pause and to listen deeply as we have done this morning, to return again and again to love. And this is a choice, and it takes time. We listen to expand our horizons, to understand more, to get out of the bubble of ourselves, to be called back into the interdependent web of all of existence. And Chris said something else that really caught my attention. We listen to those stories. We expand our consciousness. We build connections with others. We clamor for justice with those who are of a like mind in order to have that water cooler moment. Who knows what the virtual equivalent of that water cooler moment might be? Maybe it's a PM on Facebook where you can say, you know what I heard about? Let me tell you a story. Let me tell you about the children of Guam. Let me tell you about what I heard this morning at worship. Let me tell you about Chris Matthews and their story. That is how justice begins to roll like water. That is how a movement is built, story upon story, heart to heart, by pausing, receiving, and giving. And this takes time. It takes time to repair and restore the systemic oppression that keeps too many ensnared in poverty, cycles of violence and disenfranchisement. It takes time to decolonize our minds. I encourage you to go look at the 30 Days of Love resources for this week. There's an entire section on decolonizing our minds, our spirits, and our ways of life. It means decolonizing our laws, our cultural norms. It takes time. It takes time to unthread the legacy of Jim Crow laws from our schools, our finances, and public policy. It takes time to draw parallels from historic tragedies and horrific violence and quiet, unjust laws to the brokenness of our world today. The echoes and the ghosts are still among us. So when AIDS activist Vito Russo talked about the AIDS crisis and how he and too many others weren't just dying of AIDS, but he and they were dying from racism and homophobia and indifference. The same could be said of the echoes of the crises of our time today. Income inequality, the growing wealth gap, environmental devastation, lack of universal health care, quality education, safe living conditions, all of these systemic problems have roots in racism, colonialism, and fear and hatred of queer, BIPOC, and marginalized people. And so, therefore, my beloveds, we are called to pause and listen and learn, and to peel away the entrenched boundaries of gender and race and class, to listen and to absorb not only to the generational trauma of marginalized communities, but to our and their pride and ability to survive. Elie Wiesel reminds us that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. The opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. So may we take a page from the life of the mystic and beautiful sloth and slow down to push back against indifference in order to repair and restore, in order to recenter and live into our first principle and demand a more perfect faith, and forgive ourselves and others for the ways that we have fallen short, patted ourselves with psychic and spiritual indifference, and move towards living an interdependent, intersectional justice informed faith. And so, this is my humble challenge for you this day, this week, this month, in this time of physical distancing and yet remaining spiritually close. I humbly ask you to consider, how are you pushing back? How are you affirming that holy pause? How are you expanding your heart and your faith and leaning in towards sacred repair, towards our collective liberation? With that challenge, with that holy hard question, may it be so.